Hello and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid Exam Skills. And today we're going to look at the 5-mark source questions which are found on the depth study part of the paper. Now, before we begin, we should have a little disclaimer. The advice here is not the only way to approach these questions. These are certainly not strictly specified by the exam board. What these are a collection of techniques and tricks and hints that have worked quite well for students in the past. If your teacher gives you different advice, the golden rule is always follow your own teacher's advice, not just some weirdo on the internet. And all the examples given in this video are from the specimen exam papers and the example answers found on the OCR Ancient History GCSE website. So let's start with, where on earth do you find these 5-mark questions? Well, the first problem you're going to have is make sure you find the right depth study. Unlike the period studies for GCSE, there are 3 different depth studies. You will only have studied one. For the purposes of this video, we're only going to look at examples from Alexander the Great and Cleopatra and Rome. Sorry if you don't study those units. These are the units I teach and the ones we're most comfortable answering. But most importantly, the techniques that will work for this particular depth study will work for all the possible depth studies. So, step 1 of answering this question is obviously to work out what does the question want, but also what doesn't it want. Now, this is only a 5-mark question, so what it doesn't want is a very lengthy response. It's specifically about a printed source or a printed source extract, so as you'd expect, you need to focus particularly on the details of that source. If you want to bring in some wider knowledge to help explain what you're writing or contextualize it, that is fine. But the primary assessment objective for this question is looking at, can you read this source, can you interpret it, and can you infer information from this? So you've absolutely got to be focused on the source. So let's start by looking at an example. This is an example from the Alexander the Great paper, the specimen paper. It's a little extract from Diodorus. It's covering the assassination of Philip II. And the question we see is, what can we learn from passage D about the relationship between Philip and his men? This question stem is very, very typical, very standard. This idea of what can we learn from this passage? So ultimately, it's asking you to decipher what's in front of you and do you understand what is going on? What can we learn about a specific thing from this passage? And now for some good news. What you will find with the majority of these source questions, regardless of which topic you're studying or which year the particular question paper is, what you'll find with these sources is there's usually more than you need within that little extract, within what I've heard called as a Gobbit. So I've highlighted some of the key things I would extract from this source already. Again, it's particularly about Philip's relationship with him and his men. One thing I would strongly advise, and one thing that keeps cropping up in the mark scheme, is try and make sure you cover the full breadth of the source. Try and reach 3 points, one from the start, one from the middle, and one from the end. If you're lucky enough that the source has an ellipsis in it, and we'll look at an example with that later on, that ellipsis has been put in to cut something out so you get to the bit that they want you to get to at the end. So if you see an ellipsis, always look at what follows this. So have a quick pause of the video, have a look at what I've highlighted. These are just 3 things I've extracted from the source about Philip's relationship with his men. It does bounce all over the shop quite a bit, so we talk about a personal anger with Pausanias, one of his men, who has been wronged. The middle bit I've highlighted talks about Philip being friends and his bodyguards keeping their distance, suggesting that Philip was certainly in this instance very comfortable around his men and this quite friendly, jovial relationship with them. And then the final bit, we see the bodyguards rushing off to the body of the king. So again, we can pick up from that there's some kind of fondness or a good relationship between at least some of his men. Obviously not all of them, because one of them has just killed him. So one of the key tricks to this question, when you come to actually answer it, and there's a sample answer on the screen again, if you want to pause it and have a read, that's always a good idea. The key thing is not to be too fancy. Get to the point, get straight in and start extracting the 3 key things, maybe 4, that you want to take from this. You only have effectively 5 minutes, maybe less to do this. It's only 5 marks. So we're not interested in fancy introductions or cunning conclusions. It's what things can you get from this source. So if you have a look at this example on the screen, this is exactly what it does. It picks out, initially there are conflicting views about Philip's relationship with his men, or depending on which men we're talking about. It highlights the kind of negative relationship with one particular person, and we can see a little bit of detail, a little bit of extra knowledge to develop that, but it's straight to the point. Now this would get 5 marks. This is what the exam board gave this. Really, the only way you could possibly improve upon this answer would be to directly quote the source. Another trick, given that you've got so little time, rather than thinking how you'd rephrase something, if the writers have already said it how you want to say it, quote them. Why not? Save yourself some thinking time, because you're going to need it later. So this sample, you can see it's relatively short. Don't forget it's typed, so it may seem shorter than it actually is. But get straight to the point, extract your points, and just carry on, because effectively you're going to have much more work to do later on. And now if we look at an example from the Rome paper, again this is Cleopatra, we see a relatively brief extract with plenty to write about. Good news here, this passage has not only 1 but 2 ellipses. This is quite useful again in a rush. It helps you lay out where you're looking for your key points. The ellipsis represents a whole chunk of text that the exam board have decided to ditch because it's not necessarily relevant to you. So this is a good example of the exam board giving you a helping hand. It's rare that that happens, but thank them when they do. So have a quick pause of the screen, have a read of the source, and look at how you'd extract this. So again, I've highlighted the extract. I am aware that it looks like I've basically just coloured it in, and this is always one of the problems with highlighting sources or highlighting them in exams, that you can effectively just colour it in. But given this question is very broad, what can we learn about the Battle of Actium? That's a very broad question, and there's almost more, there is definitely more here than you'd actually need. So you're going to have to do a degree of cherry picking. But again, start with the work on the start, the middle, and the ending. So I've picked out here that in terms of what can we learn about the Battle of Actium, well, we can see it's now between Octavian and Antony, and most importantly, they're fighting with fleets. So this is a naval battle. That's the first obvious point you'd want to make. Then the second bit is the description of the 2 sides. Obviously, there's a clear emphasis on the superiority of Octavian's forces, and the negative response of Cleopatra to this. Obviously, we'll pick out that she flees, she does run, she legs it. That's a key thing you could mention about the battle. And then finally, towards the end, I've picked up that the men continued fighting, Antony's men continued fighting, despite the fact that their 2 leaders had done one. And the last bit, should you want to include it, is that it's Cleopatra's decision to effectively abandon the battle. So even by looking at this brief extract, you should be able to see there's more than enough. If you've got a very broad question, there's more than enough for you to write about. You shouldn't necessarily be struggling. So again, here's a sample answer from the OCR sample answers. Again, it seems relatively brief, but it does the key things. It gets straight to the point, points out that the Battle of Actium was on sea, and it then goes on to develop this. We've got some nice quotes where we're talking about the discrepancy between the 2 sides. One side had everything it needed, the other only had soldiers. And then it again looks at the leadership of Antony and Cleopatra. Now, what's different with this answer, why it's probably a bit more robust than the Alexander one, is, as I've said, it uses direct quotes, which is never a bad thing. But also, it's using a little bit of knowledge just to help explain the points that are being made. This fits under this broad heading of using and analysing ancient sources. You can't get away with just copying down 3 extracts from the source and hoping that's good enough. You've got to take out the key bits of information and just kind of smooth around the edges. Show that you actually know what's going on, that you've actually studied this, and you've not just accidentally started trying to answer the wrong section of the paper. This does happen, but you're trying to show that, yeah, you understand what this source is saying, but the key message is the same. 3 points cover the whole of the source, and it's straight in, it's perfunctory, it does what it needs to do. And this one actually offers a little bit of judgment, particularly about Cleopatra and Antony, which, to be fair, from this source is not hard to get. So, to sum up, 5-mark depth study source questions. Step 1, focus on what is in the source. Remember, the source is there to help you, it is your friend. Try and cover the entirety of the source, cover the whole thing. Ideally aim for 3 points. 3 is a very good number when it comes to exams. But try and get something from the start, something from the middle, and something from the end. Remember, of the entire body of evidence that the exam board can throw at you, they've chosen this bit specifically. Where possible, or if there is one, look for an ellipsis. How does that help you decide what bits you're going to write about? Will that help break the passage up? Use your knowledge as well as context rather than the focus of the question. Use it to kind of put the icing on the cake, smooth around the edges, make an answer more than just saying, it says this, it says this, it says this. And most importantly, it's only 5 marks. Don't go mad. You don't have a lot of time for this part of the exam. Try and get it done as quickly and as sensibly as possible. There's no medals for the longest answer. So that's our very brief look at a 5-mark source question and how to answer it. Hopefully this has been useful. It may not tell you anything you don't know already, but even if it acts as a little exam comfort blanket, then our work here is done. Thanks for listening. As always, leave us a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.